You can't imagine. You know, we've got to save Manny's life. I've had flashbacks. I could have done what Manny did, you know. This is really irresponsible what the government has done. Really unjust. Well, we tried our hardest. Unfortunately, there was one Vietnam vet who didn't understand. He was really the only person that counted at this point. It's the governor of California, Gray Davis. He'd actually been to Vietnam, but he had, I think, a desk job doing public relations. Naturally, when he came back to the States, he had more than a cardboard box to come back to. He had a political career to come back to. He'd campaigned on the death penalty and carrying it out and speeding it up. And so Manny Babbitts was the first case across his desk. Politically speaking, there was just no way he could commute this sentence. And he didn't. He didn't. So Bill, I guess ironically, on his brother's 50th birthday, went to San Quentin prison and watched his brother be put to death by lethal injection. You know, my brother's prosecutor had, I think actually comes from Long Island, and I think he's a decent man. I don't want to know why he sought the death penalty in this case, but you know, he went on TV and called me a hero, and a true American hero. Victims have thanked me and our family. Bill never got a thank you from anyone, not anyone at all. That was, in a sense, his thank you was like a front row seat at his brother's execution. I was invited to the funeral, which was not in California. It was in this little town off Cape Cod, Wareham, Massachusetts, where the Babbitt brothers had grown up. And the burial was it was in the May of the year, so you know what the May is like in the Northeast. There's flowers and there's smells, and it's like the whole world is springing back to life. Except here we were in a graveyard, and there's a flag-draped coffin, and there's a priest saying some words intended to comfort, and a little group of Vietnam vets and a little family group, and in the middle of that group was Bill and his mother. It's the first time I met Josephine, and she's about the same size as my mom, just a little lady, about the same age. And as they're, you know, the priest is saying some words over Manny, Mrs. Babbitt loses it. Her knees start to buckle, and you know, she starts wailing, "Oh, my son," and here's Bill trying to hold her up. And I can't imagine, you know, the burden that he's carrying at this moment. As I'm looking at that scene, the floodgates open. I couldn't stop sobbing. I mean, for me, I guess I probably held in a lot of tears throughout my ordeal. You know, you have to be strong. You don't have the luxury of indulging your emotions. But at this point, I was just crying for Bill and Manny and Ted and me and the victims and the families, and you know, it just seemed all so tragic. I just couldn't stop crying. As I drove back to Schenectady, it's about a 3-hour drive, and I was thinking, wow, you know, I think people are mostly pretty good. If they'd seen what I've seen, if they saw this case, they'd see how unjust it was. They'd see that there was cruelty there, that there was real indifference, you know. It was like, you know, they were bystanders, and we're just indifferent. We let this happen. But if people really saw it happening, they'd do something. I don't know if you've ever been down to the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., but carved in granite on the frieze of that building, on the facade of that building, are 4 words. And the 4 words are equal justice under law. I'm really glad those words are there. I think they represent a really important aspiration for our culture, for our democracy. But if we delude ourselves and think they speak the truth, as it is now, we're badly mistaken. You know, it's an aspiration, it's not a reality. You know, the reason Bill and his mom were there instead of me and my mom had a lot to do with things that had nothing to do with justice, but have everything to do, you know, with those things that just define social status and social privilege in our society. And as long as we have a death penalty, you know, regardless of what you feel about the death penalty as a concept, as long as we have a death penalty that functions that way, I don't think any reasonable person can say they're for it. Well, thanks a lot. I've spent a lot of time. And I've been happy to entertain some questions too. If anybody has questions either about, the public policy issue, yes?
Could you tell me how is your brother doing now?
I wish I could. We have trouble getting information. Ted will not respond to any of our letters. He's never answered one. When he had attorneys, he told them that he wants nothing to do with us now or ever. I think partly he's feeling betrayed, but I also think this was a process that started long before. Even 10 years before the Unabomber thing, he started pushing away his family, and I think that has more to do with the mental illness than it does with resentment. But when Mom has called the prison, and she's done that a few times, she's simply told that as a federal inmate, he has a right to privacy, and unless he's willing to sign a release, they can't share any information. So we don't know about his health, we don't know if he's getting treatment. We can know sort of facts about the institution, the kind of setting he's in. It's basically 23 hours a day in a cell, basically a solitary confinement. But in terms of how he's doing, we don't know much now. So it's, for Mom in particular, that weighs on her heavily.
How did he get the good lawyers?
Yeah, it wasn't because we were wealthy. I mean, you couldn't afford lawyers at that rate. I think he, as they described it in the media, he hit the lottery. Now, Ted wouldn't think so. He tried to fire his lawyers. But it so happened that there was a very successful criminal defense attorney who had retired from private practice, basically said, his name is Quinn Denver, I think I've made enough money, now I'm going to go out and try to serve humanity. He became a federal public defender and was assigned to that district of California about 2 months before my brother was arrested. Also, there's a tremendous disparity between the resources available on the federal level and the state level. There are places like Texas where you read these horror stories of people who ended up on death row executed and their attorneys were paid like under $1,000 flat fee to defend them. But in the federal level, they have a kind of equation. It's not like parity exactly, but if they're going to spend like $5 million on the prosecution, then they're going to give like $3 million to the defense team. So this lawyer was able to hire 2 other very skillful attorneys, one who specialized in mental illness defenses and another who was just a very gifted litigator. So I think part of it was that, as the prosecution was kind of getting beat up in the media, and, as they were going against these very high-powered defense attorneys, and then the judge made some decisions that put them at a disadvantage. I think they felt, rather than deal with all this, let's just take what we can get, and life without parole is probably better for everyone. We now have in New York life without parole. We didn't have prior to 1995, and I think one of the reasons that the Assembly did not vote to reinstate the death penalty was the realization that, it's simpler, it's faster, it's much less expensive. Who's to know which is the harsher punishment, but it doesn't put us in a situation where we're, maybe executing an innocent person, because obviously you can't bring a person back to life when you recognize the mistake. To me, that, for the crimes that are the most shocking, for the most heinous crimes, life without parole makes sense as an alternative. Yes, sir.
When you first went to the authorities, did you try to work out a stipulation with them that they would not seek the death penalty? I thought I remember.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because it's one part of the media reporting that I thought has never really been accurate. And I learned a lot about how the media works. Like, you get an early story, 10 years later, as they're writing the 10-year anniversary piece, they're going back to the early story that might have some inaccurate information in it. We recognized early on that we would probably need an attorney. We didn't want to just call the 800 number. Through a friend, we found an attorney who had some previous cases with the FBI, had some contacts in the FBI, so we thought that was the way to go. But the primary thing was on my mind at that point was wanting to explore the possibility of a deal. I mean, I thought they must be desperately want the Unabomber after 17 years. They're clueless. Maybe they'd be willing to trade my brother's life in return. So I asked the attorney, even before I told him my name, it was like an anonymous call. We talked a bit, without his knowing my identity. And he researched the issue. He talked with